There were soul records in the 1960s that every American could sing along to without thinking. They poured out of jukeboxes and car radios and record players in the front room after dark. They sold millions of copies. They packed dance floors from Detroit to New Orleans. But when the story of soul got written down, most of these records got left out of it. These 25 soul songs every American knew by heart, and then somehow let slip away. Subscribe before we start so you don't miss any of our lookbacks. Number 25, Cool Jerk, The Capitals, 1966. In the summer of 1966, this record was everywhere, a hard, snapping, irresistible dance number out of Detroit that told you to do a brand new dance called the Cool Jerk. It hit the top 10 on the pop chart and went to number 2 on the rhythm and blues chart, and it has turned up in movies and commercials ever since. That guitar, that hand clap, that shouted title, you know it even if you have never known its name. But here is the secret hiding inside the record. The Capitals were a small Detroit group on a tiny label. When they went in to cut Cool Jerk, the band backing them up was none other than the Funk Brothers, the legendary uncredited musicians who played on nearly every Motown hit ever made. So the sound of Motown itself is on this record, made for a rival label, and almost nobody knows it. The Capitals never had another hit anywhere near it, and today, the group that made one of the great dance records of the decade has vanished almost without a trace. Number 24, The Dark End of the Street, James Carr, 1967. Ask people who study soul music deeply what the greatest deep soul record ever made is, and a startling number of them will name this one. It is a song about a doomed, guilty love affair, two people meeting in the shadows because they can never be seen in the light, and James Carr sang it with a haunted, bottomless ache that almost nobody could match. Out of Memphis, in 1967, he made a record that other singers still speak about with something close to awe. So why is he forgotten? Because James Carr was fighting an illness that the world had no name for at the time. He suffered from severe bipolar disorder in an era with almost no treatment for it, and it could freeze him solid. He once stood on a stage in Japan in front of a paying crowd and simply could not move or sing. His career collapsed under a condition that people mistook for unreliability. The greatest deep soul singer of them all was undone by something nobody understood, and the song lived on while the man disappeared. Number 23, Barefootin', Robert Parker, 1966. Out of New Orleans in 1966 came this pure shot of joy, a record that did nothing more complicated than tell you to take your shoes off and dance, and did it so well that it went top 10 across the country. Robert Parker was a veteran session saxophone player who had blown his horn on New Orleans classics for years before he ever stepped up to sing. When he finally did, he made one of the great feel-good records of the decade, and that was essentially it. Barefootin' was so big and so completely his one moment that everything after it lived in its shadow. Robert Parker kept playing around New Orleans for decades, a beloved local figure, while the rest of the country slowly forgot the man behind a song they still knew every word of. It is one of the happiest records on this entire list, and one of the most completely forgotten. Number 22, 60-Minute Man, Billy Ward and His Dominoes, 1951. This record is so early it barely counts as soul yet. It counts as the thing soul came out of in 1951 before rock and roll had a name. Billy Ward and His Dominoes cut a swaggering, wildly suggestive song about a man boasting of exactly what he could do for a woman, and for its time it was shocking. It crossed over from the rhythm and blues chart to the pop chart at a moment when that almost never happened, and it is considered by many historians to be one of the very first rock and roll records ever made. The bass voice booming out those boasts belonged to a singer named Bill Brown, but the group was a factory for talent. Both Clyde McPhatter and Jackie Wilson passed through the Dominoes. Billy Ward ran it like a boss, not a bandmate, and the singers stayed anonymous behind the group name. So one of the foundational records of all popular music sits here almost completely forgotten, its singers uncredited, its importance quietly enormous. Number 21, Western movies, The Olympics, 1958. Here is a novelty record that has no business being as good as it is. In 1958, the Olympics cut a song about a man whose girlfriend is so obsessed with watching westerns on television that he cannot get a moment of her attention, complete with gunshots and cavalry bugle calls firing off in the background. It was silly, it was catchy, and it went top 10, and it made the group briefly famous on both sides of the Atlantic. The Olympics were one of those groups that kept the party going for years, cutting dance records and novelty numbers that always sounded like a good time. But they never landed the one big serious hit that turns a fun group into a remembered one. They toured, they recorded, they entertained, and the culture moved past them. A record that made an entire country laugh and dance in 1958 is now known only to collectors of a very specific kind. Number 20, Double Shot, The Swingin' Medallions, 1966. This might be the rowdiest record on the entire list, a raucous, horn-blasting, half-shouted song about a man suffering the consequences of a double shot of loving the night before, played by a band of college kids out of South Carolina. It became the ultimate fraternity party anthem of the mid-60s, the sound of a room full of people who had stopped caring how they looked. It bubbled up out of the South and went national. The Swingin' Medallions were, quite literally, a bunch of students, and that turned out to be both their charm and their ceiling. They were a live sensation, a band that could set a room on fire, but the recording career never climbed past that one enormous party record. They kept performing it for decades at reunions and beach music festivals. And beyond that devoted world, the record that soundtracked 1,000 college parties simply faded from the national memory. Number 19, The Nitty Gritty, Shirley Ellis, 1963. Before she told the whole country how to play a name game, Shirley Ellis had already scored with this one, a tough, punchy record built on a phrase that then worked its way permanently into American English. To get down to the nitty-gritty. She had a sharp, commanding voice and a writing partner named Lincoln Chase who built her a string of clever, rhythmic hits that were impossible to sit still through. Shirley Ellis is remembered today, if she's remembered at all, for The Name Game, the sing-along that turns any name into a nonsense rhyme. But she was a real artist with real range, and she walked away from the business early, in the late 1960s, while she was still young and never looked back. She left behind a handful of records that everybody half remembers and almost nobody can attribute. The phrases outlived the woman who sang them. Number 18, Function at the Junction, Shorty Long, 1966. Motown had a deep bench of talent that never got the push its stars got, and Shorty Long was one of the great lost ones. Function at the Junction is an infectious, horn-driven party record about a gathering where everybody who is anybody will be, and it showed off a performer bursting with personality and humor. He later reached the top 10 with a song called Here Comes the Judge, writing a catchphrase of the moment. Shorty Long was a multi-instrumentalist, a natural showman, and by all accounts one of the most likable men on the Motown roster. And then, in 1969, at just 29 years old, he drowned in a boating accident on the Detroit River. His career was cut off just as it was building, and because he had never quite become a headliner, the loss faded from public memory fast. A hugely gifted entertainer left behind a party record and very little chance to be remembered. Number 17, Cry to Me, Solomon Burke, 1962. Before soul music had fully found itself, Solomon Burke was showing it the way. Cry to Me, from 1962, is one of the foundational records of the entire genre, a slow, aching, gospel-rooted plea to a lonely woman, and it helped teach Atlantic Records how soul was supposed to sound. That rolling rhythm, that pleading voice. The Rolling Stones loved it enough to record it themselves. Solomon Burke was one of the true architects, the man they crowned the king of rock and soul. And yet the wider public let his name slip while the artists who learned from him became legends. He was also one of the most extraordinary characters the music ever produced, an ordained bishop who ran his own church and, at various points, a chain of mortuaries. He sold food to the crowds at his own shows, and still, the man who helped invent soul is a footnote to most of the people who love it. Number 16, Mother-in-Law, Ernie K. Doe, 1961. For one glorious week in 1961, Ernie K. Doe sat on top of the entire American music world. Mother-in-Law, a comic lament about the woman who has moved in and made his life miserable, went to number one on both the pop and the rhythm and blues charts, powered by a deep booming bass voice answering K. Doe on the title line. It is one of the great New Orleans records, funny and sharp and perfectly built. And here's how close it came to never existing. Allen Toussaint, the genius who wrote and produced it, thought the song was no good and literally threw the demo in a trash can. One of the backup singers fished it out and talked K. Doe into trying it again. That rescued scrap of paper became a number one record. Ernie K. Doe never had another pop hit anywhere near it, and he spent his later years as a beloved, gloriously eccentric New Orleans character, crowning himself the emperor of the universe, while the record that made him faded from the country that once sang it. If a song on this list has stirred a memory, subscribe now and stay with me. The biggest records are still ahead. Number 15, Expressway to Your Heart, The Soul Survivors, 1967. In 1967, a group of white singers from the New York and Philadelphia area cut a driving, horn-punched record about being stuck in traffic on the road to a woman's love, complete with car horns honking through the mix. It was one of the first real hits for two young songwriter-producers named Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff, and it climbed into the Pop Top 10. You can hear, right there in the grooves, the sound those two men were about to unleash on the world. Because within a few years, Gamble and Huff would build the sound of Philadelphia, the lush, sophisticated soul empire that produced hit after hit after hit through the 1970s. This record was the seed of all of it. But the group that sang it, the Soul Survivors, never became stars themselves, and their moment passed quickly. The record that helped launch one of the biggest production teams in music history is remembered by almost no one who did not live through it. Number 14, G.E.E. Whiz, Carla Thomas, 1961. Every empire has a first brick, and for the mighty Stax Records, the label that gave the world Otis Redding and Sam and Dave and so much more, the first brick was this. Gee Whiz, a tender, yearning teenage love song, was written by a young woman named Carla Thomas when she was still in high school, and when it became a national hit in 1961, it put the Little Memphis label on the map for the first time. They called her the Queen of Memphis Soul, and she was genuine royalty, the daughter of the disc jockey and performer Rufus Thomas, and a hitmaker in her own right for years. But Carla Thomas chose a quieter path than stardom demanded, stepping back from the relentless grind of the business. The label she helped build became one of the most important in American history. The teenager whose song started it all became a name that only Stax devotees still say out loud. Number 13, Soulfinger, The Bar-Kays, 1967. This one is a party in a single record, a blaring, joyous instrumental built on one of the most recognizable horn lines of the decade. Here is how they made it. The Bar-Kays were teenagers, the young house band coming up at Stax, and when they cut the track, they pulled a bunch of neighborhood kids in off the street to shout the title into the microphone and paid them for it with bottles of Coca-Cola. It went top 20 in 1967 and made the young band briefly famous. And then came one of the great tragedies in music history. Otis Redding took the Bar-Kays on as his backing bands, and on the 10th of December 1967, they climbed onto his private plane. It went down into a freezing Wisconsin lake. 4 of the 6 Bar-Kays died alongside Redding. Only one member on the plane survived, and the bass player lived only because he had taken a separate flight. The joyous record they had made months earlier suddenly belonged to a band that was mostly gone. It is impossible to hear Soulfinger the same way once you know. Number 12, The Duke of Earl, Gene Chandler, 1962. Duke, 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 Duke of Earl. If you were alive in 1962, that chant is already playing in your head, because that the Duke of Earl was inescapable. It came out of the Chicago doo-wop scene, built on a warm-up exercise the group used to sing to loosen their voices, and it shot to number 1 on both the pop and the rhythm and blues charts and sold over 1 million copies in barely a month. It is one of the defining vocal records of its moment. Gene Chandler leaned into it so hard that he began performing dressed as an actual nobleman, in a cape, a monocle, and a top hat, billing himself as the Duke of Earl. The problem with becoming a character that big is that it can swallow the man. Gene Chandler had real talent and later hits, including the wonderful Nothing Can Stop Me, but he could never fully escape the crown he had put on. Today, the chant survives everywhere, and the singer behind it has quietly slipped out of view. Number 11, Cowboys to Girls, The Intruders, 1968. Before Philadelphia soul conquered the world, it had to have a first number one, and this was it. Cowboys to Girls is a tender, grown-up song about the moment a boy stops playing cowboys and starts noticing the girls next door, and in 1968 it became the first number one rhythm and blues hit written and produced by Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff. Everything that lush Philadelphia empire would become started with this gentle, aching record by a group called the Intruders. The Intruders were a crucial piece of soul history, the act that proved the Gamble and Huff formula could top the charts. But they were the foundation, not the skyscraper, and when the O'Jays and Harold Melvin and Teddy Pendergrass came along and became superstars on that same sound, the group that laid the first stone got left behind. The men who scored the very first Philadelphia Soul number one are strangers to almost everyone who loves the music they helped invent. Number 10, Time is Tight, Booker T and the MGS, 1969. You have heard this band 1,000 times without ever knowing their name, because Booker T and the MGS were the house band at Stax Records, the musicians playing behind Otis Redding, Sam and Dave, Wilson Pickett, and dozens more. But they were also stars in their own right, and Time is Tight from 1969 is their masterpiece, a slow-building, organ-driven instrumental that climbs and climbs until it feels like the whole city is moving. Here is what made them remarkable beyond the music. In the segregated American South of the 1960s, Booker T and the MGS were a racially integrated band, black and white musicians playing together as equals at a time when that was genuinely dangerous. They were the sound of Memphis soul itself, the engine underneath 100 hits. And because they stood behind the singers rather than in front of them, the band that built the Stax sound is a name most people have simply never learned. Number 9, The In Crowd, Dobie Gray, 1965. I'm in with the In Crowd. In 1965, that line was a badge of belonging, and Dobie Gray sang it with such effortless cool that the record became an anthem for anyone who wanted to feel like they were on the inside. It went top 20 pop and became one of the great mod and soul club favorites, a song about being where it is happening, sung by a man who sounded like he had never been anywhere else. But Dobie Gray had one of the strangest career shapes in music. Nearly a decade after The In Crowd, he came back with a completely different kind of record, a soft, country-tinged classic called Drift Away, the one with the chorus about giving yourself the rock and roll and letting it free your soul. Two enormous hits, a decade apart in two different styles. And somehow, the man who sang both of them became one of those voices everyone knows and nobody can name. He got forgotten twice. Number 8, Stay, Maurice Williams and the Zodiacs, 1960. At 1 minute and 36 seconds, Stay holds a record that still stands. It is the shortest song ever to reach number 1 on the American pop chart. Maurice Williams wrote it as a teenager, a breathless plea to a girl to stay just a little bit longer, and that soaring falsetto cry in the middle, "Come on and stay," is one of the most recognizable sounds in all of early soul. In 1960, it went all the way to the top. Maurice Williams had actually written another giant song years earlier, Little Darlin', which became a smash for another group entirely. But Stay was his, and it has never really left the culture, turning up in films and on oldies radio for over 60 years. And yet Maurice Williams and the Zodiacs remain almost completely anonymous, the makers of a record everyone can sing and nobody can credit. The song stayed. The name did not. Number 7, Tell It Like It Is, Aaron Neville, 1966. That voice. There is nothing else in soul music quite like Aaron Neville's high, quivering, impossibly tender tenor, and in 1966 it carried Tell It Like It Is all the way to number 1 on the Rhythm and Blues chart and into the Pop Top 10. It is one of the great New Orleans records, a smooth, pleading masterpiece that announced one of the most distinctive singers America ever produced, and it earned him almost nothing. The small New Orleans label that released it went bankrupt, and Aaron Neville watched his number 1 record generate no real money at all. He went back to working on the docks in New Orleans to support his family, a man with a chart-topping hit-loading cargo by day. It would take more than 20 years, and the Neville brothers, and a famous duet with Linda Ronstadt, before he finally got his due. One of the most beautiful voices in the history of the music nearly slipped away entirely. Number 6, 96, Tears, ? And the Mysterians, 1966. Here is one of the strangest number 1 records ever made. In 1966, a band of young Mexican-American musicians from Michigan, fronted by a mysterious singer who called himself only ? And refused to be seen without dark sunglasses, cut a raw, cheap, organ-driven song about heartbreak in a garage. It went all the way to number 1, sold 1 million copies, and helped invent the entire sound that would later be called garage rock and punk. And the band around it stayed a genuine mystery. ? Claimed to be from another planet and insisted he had lived among dinosaurs. He legally changed his name to the punctuation mark. To this day, the group has fought over royalties and recognition for a record that influenced thousands of bands. It is a true American oddity, a number 1 hit by a man who would not show his eyes, and outside of collectors and historians, it has mostly vanished from memory. Number 5, Grazing in the Grass, Hugh Masekela, 1968. An instrumental with no words at all went to number 1 in America in 1968 and sold 4 million copies, and the man who made it was a South African trumpet player in political exile. Grazing in the Grass is pure sunshine, a bright, cowbell-driven groove that sounds like the first warm day of the year, and it became one of the biggest records of the decade almost by accident. It was cut as filler when Hugh Masekela's album came up 3 minutes short. But the story behind the joy is heavy. Hugh Masekela had fled South Africa after the government massacred 69 peaceful protesters and banned public gatherings. He built a career in exile and later wrote searing anti-apartheid anthems and toured with Paul Simon. This sunny instrumental was the moment the whole world briefly knew his name. And then the moment passed, and one of the most joyful number 1 records ever made drifted quietly out of the American memory it once filled. Number 4, Rescue Me, Fontella Bass, 1965. Come On and Rescue Me. Almost everyone in America knows that record, and here is the cruel joke at the center of it. Most of them think it is Aretha Franklin. It is not. It is Fontella Bass who cut Rescue Me for Chess Records in Chicago in 1965, took it to number 1 on the Rhythm and Blues chart and number 4 on the Pop chart, and then spent the rest of her life being mistaken for somebody else. The drummer on the record, by the way, was a young Maurice White who would go on to build Earth, Wind and Fire. And it gets worse. Fontella Bass helped write Rescue Me in a studio jam session, and then watched the songwriting credit and the money go to other people. She fought for over 20 years to be recognized as a writer of her own biggest hit. She made a living singing commercials while her signature song played on every oldies station in the country under a cloud of mistaken identity, a number 1 record remembered as someone else's that barely paid the woman who sang it. Number 3, Oh Happy Day, the Edwin Hawkins Singers, 1969. Nobody planned this one. In 1967, a young choir director in the Bay Area took a dusty old church hymn from the 1700s, sped it up, added a swinging piano and a soaring lead vocal, and recorded it in a church with his youth choir, pressing a few copies to sell locally. Somehow, a San Francisco radio station got hold of it, and then the whole country did. Oh Happy Day climbed to number 4 on the Pop chart and sold 7 million copies around the world. It was a genuine miracle record, a gospel song that crossed over into mainstream pop at a scale that had almost never happened before or since, and it won a Grammy and opened the door for gospel to reach a mass audience. But the Edwin Hawkins Singers were a choir, not pop stars, and they never repeated it. A record that brought a kind of joy to millions of people in a hard year became, over time, a song everyone half remembers hearing and almost nobody can tell you the first thing about. Number 2, Money. That's What I Want, Barrett Strong, 1959. This is the record that built an empire. In 1959, before Motown was Motown, a young singer named Barrett Strong cut a hard, hungry, pounding song about the one thing everybody really wants. And Money became the first genuine hit for Berry Gordy's brand new company. Every Motown record that ever followed, every Supremes and Temptations and Marvin Gaye classic, stands on top of this one. The Beatles covered it. The Rolling Stones covered it. It never goes away. But Barrett Strong got branded a one-hit wonder as a singer, and that is the smallest part of his story. He became one of the greatest songwriters Motown ever had, co-writing I Heard It Through the Grapevine War and the run of records that turned the Temptations into geniuses. Cloud 9, Papa Was a Rolling Stone, Ball of Confusion. And for decades he fought over credit and royalties for songs that shaped the sound of America. The man who gave Motown its first hit, and then wrote some of its greatest, spent his life under-recognized for both. Number 1, The Twist, Hank Ballard, 1959. Here is the biggest one of all, and the most forgotten in the strangest way. The Twist set off the largest dance craze in the history of American music. It is the only record ever to reach number 1 on the pop chart in 2 separate years. It got adults out on the dance floor for the first time in the rock and roll era. Everybody in America did the Twist, and almost nobody knows that the man who wrote it and recorded it first was named Hank Ballard. Hank Ballard cut The Twist in 1959, first as the B-side of another single. He wrote it. It was his. But a television host thought his version was too raw for a national audience and had a clean-cut young singer named Chubby Checker record a note-for-note copy instead. Checker's version became the phenomenon, and Chubby Checker became the face of the Twist forever. Hank Ballard stood by and watched another man become synonymous with his own song. Years later, he put it as plainly as anyone could. They call Chubby the father of the Twist, he said. But he is just the stepfather. I'm the father. It's my baby. And that is the whole story of this list in a single sentence. These records were the soundtrack of a country, written and sung by people who poured everything they had into 2 or 3 minutes of magic and then watched the credit or the money or the memory go to somebody else or to no one at all. They filled every jukebox and every radio in America, and one by one, the country that once knew them by heart simply let them slip away. If we brought even one of them back to you tonight, then maybe they were never really lost. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe, and watch the next video above.